Go back to our panel now. We've got David Gazzard, DPG Advisory Director, former long-serving Liberal advisor, and Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute, the Executive Director there. Gentlemen, great to see you both. David, let's start with, I want to start with the war footing that the Prime Minister described it as in terms of the National Cabinet. Is that overstating it? Isn't it basically him just recognising they've got a problem here in terms of the vaccine rollout?
It's a point of emphasis, there's no doubt. And in the myriad of decisions that's been taken, there's now a whole range of complications that have emerged, mainly due to overseas supply, which was constricted by some European countries, that have led to other things now needed to be recalibrated. And of course, there's now a whole rollout across the states in different forms and in different guises that is going to need the states to come on board. So one of the reasons we were so successful in terms of combating the virus in the first place, so that we now have effectively zero transmission, zero deaths, is that National Cabinet worked together well with the feds and the states. So I think he's going back to what was a well-tested program to get this under control.
Maybe it's where he should have started with this as opposed to where they've got to. They should have started with this regular discourse, because there seems to me, well, there is a lack of trust between the state and federal governments on this stuff.
Yeah, well, I heard Andrew Clennell's observations before that every state minister was, his words, pissed off with how they were being treated and locked out of announcement strategies. I think the war analogy is over the top. I don't think it's actually helpful. Yes, more needs to be done, but I think that kind of exaggerated language doesn't kind of cut it in the end. And if people keep talking like that, doesn't get to the crux of it. It does look a little bit like blame shifting, and there's been a kind of series of what looks like incompetencies building up on the Morrison government. Whether it's the Holgate affair or whether it's handling the tin ear on women's issues, and now this. As Andrew Clennell said, it is an admission that things are going wrong. But at its heart, it's lack of supply. And now I know, of course, we're subject to international forces, but every country is in the same boat, subject to international forces, and we needed to have got more supply. I think the terrible thing that we didn't do, and we still should do, is build that mRNA facility and factory so that we can build our own vaccines, the ones that are going to be more adaptable and more useful in the long term too.
The government might still do that, because that's the Pfizer-type vaccine, which, according to the experts, is easier to adapt to a new variant, a new strain. Mark Butler this afternoon said on this program that he supports the building of that capacity, and that experts have, yesterday, the president of the Academy of Science told me that someone like CSL could do that within months.
There's no doubt. I think one of the things that this crisis has taught Australia is we've got to be more self-reliant in supply chains. There's no doubt about that. I agree with Ben on that. But I would just point to, I mean, in terms of the rollout, one of the things the PM said this week, which I thought was really, really useful, was people trust their GPs. They want to go to the GP to get advice around it. If you have side effects, you want to go back to the GP. One of the great things about the way the virus and the pandemic has been handled is the government chose early to go back to existing delivery channels. That was very clear advice from Treasury, and it's been very clear advice from Health. So to suddenly throw it all in the air and say, no, don't go to your GP, turn it all over the states, and we'd had problems with the states with the Ruby Princess, and of course there'd been the quarantine debacle in Victoria. Why not go to your trusted supply chain, which was the GPs? And that's still happening, and it's ramping up quickly. And we're probably going to be in a position in just a few weeks where you're getting mass vaccinations through 4,000 GP clinics that are receiving it now.
The government certainly needs that. It hasn't been a great few months really. Yesterday, former Australia Post CEO Christine Holgate really came in swinging, and today the Communications Minister has defended the government's position and said that they stand by what was said at the time. Well, and it was actually Labor and Labor questioning that put her in the tough spot publicly?
I think she was treated abysmally, and I think that's what came out at the Senate inquiry yesterday. And she was essentially bullied out of her job. When an inquiry found that she's done nothing illegal, she said she was stood down without her agreement. She issued a resignation when she'd asked for sick leave and it had not been given. She issued a resignation while she was suicidal. Any employer should have said, have the sick leave. No, we're not going to look at that resignation letter now that you're in this bad state of health. She was treated appallingly over a decision to give bonuses to executives that had performed well, who had saved Australia Post. I think it's been a terrible look for the government, and I still think that the government needs to do something in some form of apology. The Prime Minister said today he regretted it, any offence caused to her, but that he had essentially done nothing wrong. And I just don't think that cuts it, given the gravity of what's happened to this woman. And it's not too late to issue an apology to her, to get on the phone and say, I'm sorry. But I think at the end of the day, when you've got a chairman still there at Australia Post, the one woman involved being forced essentially out by the Prime Minister, and I think it's really disingenuous for him to say he hadn't. No one believes that he didn't force her out, that it's the one woman who got done, while the chair of Australia Post is not held accountable, and neither is the Prime Minister.
The Labor Party also was critical of the watches, the choice to give watches, those Cartier watches. We should remember that.
I think
there were criticisms on the record at the time.
It's a very good point, and it's easy to go back and look at all the entrils and come up in a highly unique situation and say, oh well, this was done and that was done, this was terrible. We need to remember the context here. We were coming out of the back of the Royal Commission into Financial Services. The government had just been flayed by the opposition for months and months and months about corporate malfeasance and overspending and too much bonuses, and this had happened and that had happened, and they'd stared death in the face going into the last election. The PM on that day was sending a message to corporate Australia, I'm not going to stand up and absorb questions here for what you've done in a corporate sense. And a CEO who'd handed out $20,000 in luxury watches when it's a government-owned entity without board approval, as it turns out today from the interview you did with the Communications Minister, has questions to answer, as Anthony Albanese has conceded. Now, whether it was tough, whether it was difficult, what her state of mind was, where the chairman was, as Ben points out, who did what to whom, those are questions of judgment that she was accountable to the Parliament for, and she got the rough and tumble of it. Now, as it turns out,
she was forced to resign by the Prime Minister's words without any due process. That's the reality.
He made it very clear he expected that, but in the context of where we'd been from the Royal Commission into Financial Services, where this had been a major issue, and ASIC had been funded at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, the ACCC had been funded with $100 million. It was not unreasonable to expect there'd be some scrutiny on $20,000 of luxury watches.
David, Ben, gentlemen, appreciate it as always. See you next week. Thank you.
Bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.